How are you doing? It's another week. Um, August is almost done. Can't believe. Okay, so our guest is ready. Let me bring on our guest. Hello.
Oh,
How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm happy to finally get you on here. Um, it's been a roller coaster.
Finally,
Exactly. You
yeah,
know,
I'm finally glad we made it happen.
I'm excited to have you. Our guest for today, for our viewers who are watching, it's Athambile Masola. She is, I don't know why she goes by overthinking teacher, um, but she is a teacher, she is a researcher, she's a writer, and I know right now you're now at University of Pretoria. You're teaching there. So should I say
Mm-hmm.
you're now a professor now?
No, I'm on my way to being a professor, I hope.
Right.
Yeah,
We,
doctorate. So I'm only like in the first lap in.
okay. Um, I guess I'm happy to have you because August in South Africa is Women's Month. And basically, your work has been amazing. And a lot of stuff or your work you're doing is to dig into the history of women and for women empowerment. And you keep on putting amazing stuff out there and trying to make sure we know that women have contributed and are still contributing. So I am happy to have you for this is the it's the dying days of August, but it is still the month of uh, celebrating women in South Africa. It stems from, I believe, a date in August in 1956, some way back, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
your history.
So I'm gonna start maybe with you, maybe just give a brief introduction of yourself, and then we can get into some of the stuff you're doing.
Okay, so my name's Athambile, as you already said. I am a researcher. I am a lecturer at the University of Pretoria. I am a writer. I'm a poet. I am interested in what we call marginal stories. So I think of my life's work as making that are there and have happened kind of more visible. So resisting this idea of erasure and invisible in the making Black women in particular invisible. Um, I'm a blogger as well. I'm also a podcaster. So I do quite a few things on the side outside of my day job in a sense, but I like to think of myself as someone who creates, be it
That's
research or writing, but I think creative, dare I say.
you have a resume which has a lot of stuff you do. Um, if it wasn't for your work, I would have not known much of Charlotte Mackeke. Is that how I pronounce it?
Maxeke. It's a right, it's a
It's a
black letter.
Teke. Okay. I would have not known much about her if it wasn't for the stuff you put out there. Apparently, she's the first woman to have a degree in South Africa.
Yeah, so Charlotte Maxeke's story is so fascinating. She got a degree from Wilberforce University in the early 1900s. I think it was 1903 or 1906.
Hmm.
Before even white women were getting degrees in South Africa, white women were only got admitted into universities, I think, in the 1920s, and then black women around the same time at Fort Hare University mostly. So she comes from, I guess, the sort of second generation missionary convert, was educated by sort of the first generation of missionary converted Christians in South Africa,
Hmm.
and spoke Dutch, spoke English, was taught by W.E.B. Du Bois, went to school with W.E.B. Du Bois's wife, and so is quite a prominent figure. And in South Africa, most people know her because there's a hospital named after her, and there's a tiny little street named after her in Durban. But for someone of that significance, there's very little work done to keep her legacy alive and what she represents. When she came back to South Africa, she started an organization called the Bantu Women's League, which is one of the early women's organizations at quite a large scale. She's known to have worked with women across races and across classes, and was quite a prominent figure, even with the establishment of what we call African nationalism in South Africa, with the establishment of the South African Native National Congress, which then became the African National Congress, which is like the mother body of such, the ZANU-PF of South Africa in a sense. So, so that's what she's doing for me.
But that's the thing. But with you, you're actually part of two collective groups. If you can describe those two groups, because they do the same work, but they're different. They're touching different aspects.
Yeah. So the first collective, which is one related to Charlotte Maxege's legacy, is called Asina Kutula Collective. And Asina Kutula is a Nguni word for we will not be quiet. And what it comes from poetry by the woman called Nonzizi Mqwetho, who was a contemporary and a peer of Charlotte Maxege. And what's significant about the two of them is that they are an example of women who spoke truth to power from the very, very early days. So we like to think that South African women were involved in politics with the march that you mentioned right at the beginning in 1956. But there's actually evidence of them going on past protests in the early 1900s and writings from in newspapers in the early 1920s. So we took this idea of Nonzizi Mqwetho's poetry and used the idea of Asina Kutula, we cannot keep quiet, because women have not been quiet. And so using this word from a poet who's very who's still quite not well known in South Africa, to reintroduce not only her legacy, but the legacy of other women. So the work that you're talking about is the collective that we have online, on Instagram, called Asina Kutula, and we host events around that. We aimed at both high school students and researchers and teachers, and we really want to get these narratives into the school curriculum, but we also want them to become general knowledge. We think it's important that women's stories become general knowledge and that they're not peripheral, because we're actually the majority in the world. Actually, women are 50%. There's that, I think it's a Chinese proverb, women hold up half the sky, which is such a powerful image of women holding up the world in a sense. Mm-hmm. So that's the one collective. And the other collective is called Bua Lit Collective. Now the word Bua comes from a Sotho word which means to speak. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to combine this idea of speaking and literacy and put it together. And we advocate for the use of African languages. So South African history made African languages, the politics of language in South Africa, and I guess across the world, are quite a huge thing. And so what has happened in South Africa is that African languages are seen as marginal. They're not used in political discourse. They are, even though they are the language of the majority. So we see language as a social justice issue. We see it as an issue of access to law, to healthcare, to education. And so Bua Lit Collective is about centering African languages and the ways in which we use African languages to make them a powerful and meaningful part of our everyday.
On that second one, it's interesting because like I know in Zimbabwe 60% is still in the rural, right? So in terms of the language and the access to understanding the law and everything, like you're explaining, there seem to be a disconnect there. And that one is very important across Africa, because everything now is either English or French. And people tend to forget that most countries in Africa, majority of their people are still in the rural area. And I find that one is very important. And then on the first one, you spoke about the marginalization of women's I would say their history, their contribution to their history. What do you think is improving on that now? Is there anything improving?
Yeah, no, I think it is improving. So one of the things that's really encouraged me is, in fact, I was writing a paper or I was presenting a seminar just last week, is that there are women who are actively doing the work of resisting that erasure. So in the seminar that I did, I made a list right at the end of all the women that I know, and it's not an exhaustive list, but just the people in my circle who are doing work on women. So whether it's a friend of mine who's doing work on women in combatants during exile in their MK army camps, whether it's thinking about historical women that are often left out, that we remember their sons and their fathers, and they left out. Another researcher is doing looking at women in political parties right now. So I'm encouraged by the fact that I'm not alone in the work that I do, is that there's a huge cohort of us who believe in this work. And that's actually quite new in terms of saying the past 20 years. And many of us are doing this from the space of academia, because we understand that knowledge production is still largely held in spaces such as higher education. And so it's important for us to get our PhDs, to get our master's degrees, and to stay in those institutions and teach, because then we have a way in which we can negotiate or leverage or lobby for these narratives to become mainstream in a sense. And I don't like the word mainstream, but I hope you understand what I mean.
Yes, I do.
So that is encouraging. And I think on the other hand, I mean, something quite serendipitous happens in that the stories from the past are refusing to be untold. So in that sense, I mean, it's almost like we cannot ignore those stories. They come to us in ways that we can't even piece together, you know. And a friend of mine who's a healer talks a lot about, you know, some of them kind of appear in dreams, or it will appear in conversations that you somehow find yourself getting access to an old archive. So for example, some of the archives that I worked with, I literally kind of stumbled across by mistake, and they were all online and digitized, and other people had looked at them before but hadn't seen the kind of evidence that I was looking for. So it's also that there's something in the air, in a sense. And you know, the work that we're doing in South Africa resonates. I just saw about a week ago, there's a documentary called Daughters Of. If you just look for that hashtag, Daughters Of, that's something that African American women are doing, talking about this idea of, if you want to know yourself better, it's important for you to know the names of your mothers and your grandmothers. So it's also a sense that it's actually a global movement, and there's kind of threads more than what we're doing in South Africa or even on the continent. So I'm encouraged by that. And perhaps to your point about the language issue, you know, it's for me, as you point out, I think South Africa, you're right, the continent is largely quite rural, and sometimes we want to make that a problem. And I think there's something to say that in spite of that, people have learned to survive in those contexts. And so for me, whenever I encounter particularly young people who are either don't know their African languages or have been far removed from those contexts, is to say, well, you know, don't view it as a lack. You know, that this idea that there are people in rural areas, there's a resilience there that people, those of us in urban settings, need to learn from. There are lessons there about how to work the land, and that there are struggles. I think that it's important for us to talk about those struggles and those questions of access, but that there's something there that we need to learn from. So I'm also encouraged by that work, in spite of some of the challenges that it poses.
Oh, no, that's great. I see you're actually publishing your own poems. You're going to be publishing your own poems, and it's in your own native language, right?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that.
Pardon?
If you can talk a little bit about that, what inspired that too?
Yeah, so I started doing isiXhosa. I mean, I grew up speaking isiXhosa, and I didn't study it at school. So we have a strange language policy where a Black child can go through their entire school career not learning in their mother tongue. They have the choice to, but our language policy two things happen. You either stop doing your mother tongue when you get to grade 4, which is you're 10 years old, and then you start learning mostly in English, and then your mother tongue becomes your additional language, where you would then take either Afrikaans, which is another African language, or you take your mother tongue. So it's a very strange language policy in that sense. So the first time I started taking my mother tongue as a subject in my education, I was in my 3rd year at university, and it was being introduced for the first time. And up until that point, my only encounter with isiXhosa was through church. And that was the space that made it meaningful, through the hymns and reading the Bible. And that was something that I experienced with my mother. And so the first time I got a sense of there's actually a huge intellectual tradition in isiXhosa was when I was 21 years old. And ever since then, it's almost what led me to do the Umoyah Lit Collective. But I made it my business to learn how to read and write the language. And so while I am fluent in English and I do write poetry in English, I felt it was important to make a statement about the fact that I can publish in isiXhosa, and that I will find a publisher who understands the value of creating books and literature around isiXhosa. And so that's my motivation behind that. I guess it ended up being political, even though it needn't be, but it was also just the joy of the language. I enjoy writing the language. I enjoy speaking the language. And so it was important for me to leave, not to leave, but to create that for myself, in a sense, to show, so create that and then be able to share it with other people.
No, that's great. You've been a high school teacher, and then now you are at the university level. The curriculums in Africa, are they really aligned to Africa's future? Like, empowering people in Africa, or are we just still learning about other people, especially the history and everything? What's your experience there, and how can we make things better?
Yeah, the short answer is no. Our education system is largely still very Eurocentric. And I think it's one of the things where it's so frustrating when we try and explain that to people, this idea that the colonizer can leave, or you can transfer power to African people. But the way power works is that it can still remain in institutions. And so what we found in South Africa is that, and I guess across the continent really, is that the remnants of colonialism, what people call coloniality, remain very much entrenched in the systems that we have. So education is a huge part of that system. The justice system remains very Eurocentric. The political system remains something that isn't something that people can access. I mean, we talk about democracy, but it isn't something that has a very meaningful way in which people experience their everyday life. And so, yeah, so the short answer is no. And so I think it becomes very important then for us to rectify that. So I've been working for a few years now. Friends and I started a girls' school with a Pan-African focus, and we realized just how difficult it was. Right now, I'm also in the steering committee trying to establish another school, and it's far more difficult than, watching Black Panther and getting excited about that. And I think that's pointing us in a creative direction. But it's a challenge to resist coloniality. It's a challenge to create a system based on multiplicity. So the idea of Africans are not monolingual. You will not find an African who's monolingual, ever. Whether it's in the way that they code switch or the way they trans language, but also just in the way in which they experience their humanity. Part of our African experience is multiple, but somehow we have an education system that wants to strip you of that multiplicity and wants to put you in a cookie cutter box. And so that's part of this process of how we do that. I think part of also how we do that for me is the language issues, try and retain as much of our linguistic heritage as much as possible. So the work of what's happening in Timbuktu, for example, and keeping those manuscripts, the work of finding archives in other parts of the continent. There's a beautiful series that I rely on called Women Writing Africa that comes in four editions. It features writing from half of the countries on the continent. And so it's in southern region, northern region, eastern region, and the western Sahel. And what that book is for me is an archive of women's writing from as early as the 6th century. So it becomes really important to excavate the work of what it means for the not only the past, but also that the past can help us craft the future, and that our sum total of our creativity does not lie in the 1652 or the 1798 when the Europeans arrived, is that our story is far more expensive than that, and that it is our history that's going to help us craft a new future. So I guess that's how I respond to it, is that I'm constantly dreaming of this new future, and it's hard work.
It is hard work, but the good thing is there are people like me, there are people out there who are watching the platform who understand what you're doing there is actually what we need for us to progress, for us to have changes. And this is the reason why I've been trying to get you on the platform, to just have you speak about what you're doing, because sometimes a lot of people are not knowing that there are people like you who are trying to make things right, who are trying to correct where we can see that there's something wrong here. You know, it takes a lot to be doing all the researches and putting together all the stuff you're doing. So I really appreciate the work you're doing, and I definitely hope we keep having you on the platform. You talk more about these issues. I know women empowerment means a lot to you. What is women empowerment in short for you? What do you define it as?
Wow, I mean, it's as simple as the word, as that phrase is, you know. And as I said earlier, it's the strangest thing for people who are the demographic majority to keep asking, you know, see us, see us. So when women do this work, it's not from a place of lack. It's from a place of just our reality, is that women are the people who give birth. Women are the people who keep the homes going. Women are the people who raise children. And so it seems absolutely ludicrous that you wouldn't empower the majority of the people. And so in a sense, women empowerment is a recognition of women's labor. That women's labor isn't one thing and one thing only, is that women's labor is multiple. And that women's labor should not continue to be unrecognized, whether it's numerically, with materially. So this idea that housework is not remunerated and that it continues not to be remunerated is a problem. And the fact that women's bodies are dispensable, the fact that women don't have access to proper health care, the fact that women are likely not to finish education, but even though we've seen statistics when they do finish education, it's good for everybody. So women's empowerment for me is about making the world better for everyone. When women are empowered, the world is a better place. And you know, we've seen it with what's happened with COVID. You know, I was just glancing through a thread on Twitter, is that we need to be reminded that countries where women have led have fared better in this COVID crisis than countries where men are leaders. So the evidence is also there. So for me, it's like explaining the obvious when we talk about women empowerment, because the evidence is right there. You know, women work the land, women feed the children, and men really need to take account for why they perhaps feel so aggrieved when women want to talk about women empowerment, in spite of the fact that that is the reality, is that when women are well and women are successful, everybody benefits.
I find it difficult also to understand why there's no acknowledgement, why there haven't been acknowledgement throughout history. As you point out with some of your work, that there's so much history about what men have done in our curriculums, in our education system, but there's less of what women have contributed. And another issue which I am finding so sensitive is the issue of gender-based violence, especially even in South Africa, where Africans tend to respect their mother a lot. They will know that their mother is important, but I don't know why is it with their partner, then they just end up forgetting that it's still a woman, it's still going to be a mother. And this issue seems to keep on being up there. Why do you think this issue is as big as it is in South Africa?
Sure, you'd have to ask the men, really and truly, because I think we've said everything as the women, you know.
Mm.
I think men really need to tell us why they refuse to respect women until they have a daughter or they have a good relationship with their mother. And I mean, I can be flippant about it and say perhaps it's men are sick, or I can pathologize it, which is not going to get us very far. But men really need to tell us what it is, what was their thinking behind their behaviors. And I honestly, most times I don't know. Is that maybe that they can get away with it? Is that the world is designed in such a way that they get away? So the clear example in South Africa, for example, is that a woman is less likely to get justice. Oh, sorry. A woman is less likely to get success through the justice system. A woman is less likely to get justice in her workplace. So that tells me that the structures have been designed for men to continue to behave like this. And so until we change those structures, and until men want to change the structures, and I think that's perhaps the thing, is that men don't want to change the structures, right? And so we can understand, I mean, a lot of people say, well, you know, back in the days, men used to respect their mothers. And I think it was because society was actually structured in a very different way. Society was structured that men must actually go away, and women actually lived by themselves and were very happy to raise the children by themselves, whether it was migrant labor, which was a different situation, or whether it was in the way in which we designed our compounds, or when men went to war. But so this idea of the nuclear family is something that is probably something that we need to look at as something that contributes to the ways in which we think about how family structure should be. So in South Africa, for example, women are more likely to be victims of violence through intimate partners. So before it was this idea of women get raped out there by strangers. But now we know that women are getting raped and beaten and killed by people in their homes. So there's also something about the ways in which we've designed family, we've designed the nuclear family, that men seem to think that they have all this power. And so we have to find ways of resisting that power, and that men must resist that power. And if they need to go to therapy, they must go to therapy. If they need to go and live with other men, they must go and live with other men. If they need to I don't know. There are many things that men should tell us what they need, but what women need is peace and safety and to not be killed. And so it's very difficult as a woman to answer that question, because I think that's on the door of men.
You definitely put me in the corner there with your answer. I like that's why I like what you're doing. It's a question definitely which has to go to the men, and I ask it trying to figure out if you're seeing any results, or if you're seeing maybe that these are some of the issues which are making men not act, you know. But I definitely know that the men which is there right now is at fault, and the leadership probably is not making sure this issue is addressed, you know. And it begs a lot to be asked, why is it like that? You actually wrote an article which you made me laugh though. This article was something personal. You were writing about lessons learned from your divorce, and you were talking about the structure of marriage these days. You looked at it as it's a hybrid. You said it has elements of the African tradition, and it has elements of, I would say, the British Victorian style. And we now need to re-look at all this and say, do we have structures which can help this type of marriage survive? You felt as if now the new marriages which are there, they are falling apart because of what's out there. Can you explain on that one?
Oh my gosh, you really did your research. So I think the intention behind that argument was we need to family differently. So first of all, I mean, there's this idea that people get married for love. That is such a new idea. You know, people used to get married because of resources, or people would get married to make peace, or people would get married to create friendships with another village or another family. And so because of this new idea, which I largely place on the doorstep of, you know, it was actually a media campaign, this idea of diamonds are a girl's best friend by De Beers, because they wanted to sell diamond rings. And now all of a sudden, there's this idea of this nuclear family based on love, even though it's a very strange idea. And so I think what I was struggling with in that piece, and what I think I'm still struggling with, is this idea of the family. And so in the South African example, and many other countries that were colonized, because you had such a systemic approach to destroying African families, is that what would be the systemic response to restore family within the understandings of what we have right now? So, for example, this idea of men are the head of the household, whereas for 100 years, 200 years, women have been the head of the household. You know, it's just such a strange thing to me. And the idea of, you know, a man and a woman in the household, whereas we know that women have raised children with other women. And so it's something that I guess I think about a lot in terms of how do we restructure society if we say family is the cornerstone of society, which is something I do believe. I think it sounds very conservative, but I think if we strengthen families, so for example, I think it's in Libya, or I think in other Scandinavian countries, where when couples get married, they get given a government grant. So that kind of a starter pack. Now that's an old tradition, where young men, if you got married, you are sikerwa, you get a piece of land. Or when women come of age, they get given their piece of land. So there's some practices that we know that in order for people to start up and to, you know, a rite of passage going into adulthood, something must be given to help them be able to do that work. But in the absence of all of that, and with this violent replacement of this Victorian heteronormative relationship that is underpinned by remnants of this African traditionalism that sometimes we can't quite grasp, then turns into quite a toxic mess that we still don't know how to unpick. And I think that was what I was getting at, is this toxic mess of, if this thing happened in such a violent way, how do we then talk about it openly and say, you know what we inherited or what we've got now is actually not serving us anymore. How do we actually family? And that maybe we will get to a version of familying that is healthy for everyone. But I think we forget how violent Victorian monogamous heteronormativity was. It was a violent protest. It was a violent process, and I think we haven't recovered from some of those violences, which are so anti how we want to build community and who actually builds community. So yeah, I mean, I'm glad you read that article, but it's something that I haven't quite resolved for myself.
No, I read the articles. If you can tell people where to find these articles, I know where to find them. I actually read a few which I like in there, and there's one where you were talking about if they tell you they can't find black talent, they're lying. And you shared your experience of your journey as a teacher and what was happening in your life there. If you can just tell people where they can find some of these articles.
Sure, they can find them on my blog post. I mean, I have a blog. It's called Kandilam. We can just share the link afterwards, perhaps. Mm-hmm. It's spelled IXHANTILAM.blogpost.com. And yeah, that's where I've been writing for almost 10 years now, actually. So if someone really wanted to get an in-depth analysis of my growth in the past 10 years, that's where they can find it.
Yeah, well, I bumped into you when I was trying to figure out African spirituality and Christianity. that's where I really like kind of like bumped into your work, and I started trying to, read more about what you were doing. You are also a co-creator of, you have a like you do like a podcast called Umoyah, right? You're one of the co-producers of that one. Can you talk a little bit about what also started that podcast?
Yeah, so Umoyah on African spirituality is a project a friend and I started last year. And what we found, we were both on different journeys. And we found that, I mean, I was raised Christian, another violent protest, but my great grandfather was a Baptist minister. And so it became part of our family. But when I was a kid, I remembered my mom had a calling, a spiritual calling. And there was kind of a cloud of secrecy around what she had experienced and all the rituals. So I've always grown up knowing that that happened, in spite of the fact that it kind of happened in very kind of stopped and started, and that I grew up having rituals in our home, and we would burn. My father would burn a herb called imbepo. I still don't know what it's called in English. I think it's a type of sage. And so I grew up with that, and somehow it kind of got cut off and it stopped. But then I discovered that other people had had similar experiences where they were asking themselves the same questions. And I guess for a lot of us, it was when, particularly for me, when I made the connection between colonialism and missionaries. And I was like, this is strange. And then I went back and looked at the historical narratives of people who had tried to have a hybrid approach to this new religion and what they had had for their whole lives. And so I was quite interested in finding something that makes sense for myself in that process. And so Umoyah became my friend and I, our way of sharing our experiences and finding that a lot of people were going through the same experiences. And we wanted to demystify what African spirituality is, because of this, missionary Europeanization, colonialism, they twisted the practices that we had for millennia. And so we found that you have to undo your mind about what you believe is African spirituality. So the major trope, for example, is that our ancestors are demons. So when you start dreaming of your ancestors in whatever way, somehow you are demonized. I mean, imagine. And so we wanted to respond to some of that, and it turned into such a beautiful process where, I mean, I didn't know people all the way in Canada were listening to this and across the borders. And so we managed to create season 1. And unfortunately, my friend's not unfortunately, my friend is actually working on a documentary at the moment. And once she's finished that process, we're going to start exploring season 2.
Are you finding that a lot of young people are asking the question as well, are trying to find themselves? What's the feedback in regards to that? Or they're just saying, no, I'm a Christian and that's it?
Yeah, I mean, there's been we were so stunned by the feedback and the reception to the podcast, because for the first time, people could voice those things that they'd been experiencing behind closed doors. And I think it almost goes back to the point I made earlier, is that there's something in the air that is asking people to look into the past. And I think the curiosity and the inquiry into African spirituality is one of those signals that something is saying to us, look into the past in order to be able to understand and dream about the future again. So people were very excited, and I'm still getting messages. A friend of mine is in Italy, and she's so angry with me that she hasn't had Umoyah while she's going through COVID in Italy. So there's a huge need, because I think it's also healing for people, is that it helps them restore something that was violently taken away, and that it heals part of ourselves and part of the stuff that our grandparents lost, the stuff that our parents lost. And so if we're able to reclaim those stories, reclaim that history, is that we find some kind of healing and some kind of solace, and a way to say, okay, now that I've got access to all of these things, perhaps I can make a choice for myself in terms of what would I want to believe, how would I curate my spiritual practice? Because for so long, our spiritual practice has been imposed on us or has been taken from us. and all those violent processes. So it's been an opportunity for people to find themselves, and even though that's quite a fluffy way of thinking about it, but to really interrogate themselves and interrogate their histories.
No, it's definitely a good platform because, like you're saying, a lot of people didn't know that there are other young people who are experiencing the same questions. Like they're trying to figure out who am I, what's going on, and you came out there, and coming from you, sometimes people wouldn't even be expecting it that, oh, it might come out from you to talk about African spirituality. And you make it easy, you make them realize that this is okay and this is not, it's a demonic thing like people have painted it all these years. And I was listening to all the episodes and I was just like, we need more of this. All we are trying to do is really, like you're saying, find ourselves, find who we are by our own, you know what I mean? Not by stuff from the West just being imposed on us. So I felt that podcast is very, it's actually enlightening to have such kind, and it's also informative. You were having different guests on the podcast and you talk about different things there. If you maybe tell the guests where they can find the podcast.
Yeah. So, and I just want to give a shout out to a friend of mine, Usimnigu who's also starting a different platform on Instagram. It's called Imbewu. Oh, Usimnigu, I've forgotten it. But it's called kind of the Seeds of Our Humanity. And he's also doing something similar here on Instagram. So our podcast can be found on Kaya FM website. We collaborated with one of the radio stations here in South Africa. But if you can't find it on Kaya FM, you can also find it on Iono. It's iono.com. Or if you simply look up Umoyah, which is Umoyo on African spirituality, and you'll be able to find it. And yeah, I mean, we cover so many topics. So the first episode is this question of healing, national healing, but also healing ourselves, and this question of the relationship between men and women and how fraught it has become in the, well, globally, but in the South African context, we speak to that. We speak about dreams, how to have a better relationship with our dreams and become custodians of our dreams. We spoke to musicians who were using their music to explore their spirituality. We spoke to healers and this question of intimacy between men and women, or between women and women, men and men, and questions of relationships and how we build intimacy and from a spiritual perspective. And so we wanted to build this idea that African spirituality can also respond to all the human experiences. You know, it's not so much that we all need to be healers, is that we also all can experience spirituality not simply as I am an expert on spirituality, but that I am a human being who is in the world and is finding a practice that works for me.
No, thank you so much for that platform, because that really is another thing which a lot of Africans, different, whether it's Southern African, Eastern African, Western African, we just need to talk about and try to find the way forward in regards to that. One of the things you see with you have too much going on. You really learn a lot about a lot of stuff. But a question I wanted to ask you is, you've been a teacher in the high school, and now you are at the university level. Where have you experienced where you feel like this is my purpose, or you enjoyed most in between the two?
Sure, that's such a tough question. You know, I think because my career it hasn't been such a long career. I mean, I've only been working since, I mean, it's less than 10 years actually. And 5 years of that was in the high school, and this is only my 4th year in the university. And so time-wise, and before I was a high school teacher, I was actually volunteering in schools. So the bulk of my experience has largely been in high schools. And I keep trying to find ways of staying in high schools and teaching high school. I did teacher training for 3 years. I think the thread for me is building relationships, really. And I think that's been the challenge in university, is that it's much harder to build relationships with older students for some strange reason. So I miss the fact that it really is true. I mean, I don't know if it's the way things are structured, or people come and they're adults and so they don't feel like they can learn anything from us, whereas children are genuinely interested in building relationships. And I still believe that, you know, when you work with children from a younger age, I still believe that you get a different kind of adult at the end of it. So I had started I'd actually wanted to be a primary school teacher, but couldn't find a job in primary school. And so ended up in high school for a long time. And I guess it was this belief that if I could just have an impact, even if it's 30 students over 5 years, I know I can make an impact because the ground is still fertile.
Okay.
Whereas by the time they come to us when they're 18, 19, the ground started to plow. So I mean, I'm yet to be challenged on that, because I haven't given higher education a chance. But I also understand higher education is a particular kind of project, and so I'm willing to give it a chance. But yeah, if you pushed me, I'd say I'd still like to go back to high school.
Okay. And in the education system overall, how are we doing, maybe in your country and across Africa, in terms of e-learning now that we have COVID here? A lot of universities where I am in Canada, they're also pushing for online learning. How are we doing? Because I'm thinking we have an issue with the internet, provision across countries, especially in Africa. How are we doing in that?
Yeah, it's been such a strange sort of just watching across the spectrum. So I'll start with the South African context, because that's what I know best, is that we have a digital divide. Is that people who are wealthy, who are in the suburbs, who go to private schools or middle class schools, have got far better connectivity than people in working class environments. But that's not to say that people in working class environments haven't got particular kinds of access. So we know, for example, I mean, people talk about the M-Pesa example in East Africa, for example, is that there have been so many innovations that I think the education system hasn't caught up with. So it's a real pity in the sense that we don't use cell phones as much as we could. So while most households have some kind of digital access through a cell phone, but of course the challenge is if it's only one cell phone in one household, as opposed to a middle class environment where everyone has got their own cell phone, then obviously it's very different. And so I think it's a very classed experience where people who have access and are digitally savvy, or have got access to bandwidth, or have got access to Wi-Fi, or have got access to fiber, are able to access the world in different ways. And so for as long as there's an inequality, we're going to see the gap getting larger and larger, in spite of the examples where we've seen where in rural areas they're trying to bridge this divide. But it also speaks to the nature of our education system that really isn't responding to our context. So back to the point you made earlier, what does digital mean in a rural context? It cannot be that everyone needs to go to the urban setting, to find fulfillment. And so how do we think about, I mean, there was a beautiful interview on TV just last week here in South Africa, where the former First Lady, Mrs. Mbeki, was talking about this very idea. And she kept asking the question, well, what does this idea mean to a Mlangeni in the rural areas?
Exactly.
Because Mlangeni has been able to, for 80 years of her life, raise children. And so there's something that she can contribute to the world, but you're going to tell her because she can't access X, Y, and Z, then you want to tell her how to live her life. So I think there also needs to be a way in which we listen to what people are saying in the rural and township areas about how they access information, about how they access the world, but with the understanding that we've got to minimize this gap, this inequality gap, in order for us to have equal access to information.
Man, I really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm happy you did this. You gave me a moment of your time. You came up here, and I'm happy to always have you again to talk about any other issues. You are not an overthinking teacher. You're full of wisdom. That's very important to know. And I am happy this platform, what I'm just doing is trying to showcase people like you who I know in Africa, they are doing a lot of amazing work. And it might seem like maybe you're alone there, but no, you're not alone. Like you're saying, I'm using my phone the right way. I'm connecting with what you're doing. So we are catching up to what you're doing, and it is through women like you who see the changes and who slowly see, even with we have our setbacks. For South Africa, I always tell people South Africa is still a young baby. It just came from apartheid not so long ago. Not all problems are going to be solved right away, but it's important for the leaders to listen to people like you who are putting amazing work, because these leaders are not going to be there 20 years from now, 30 years from now. It's you who are in the trenches who are going to be now there in the leadership positions. So I took it upon myself. I said I need to keep pushing and letting people know about people like you who are definitely not just saying hashtag this and sit at home. You're definitely putting in the work, and it shows. So I really appreciate what you did here, giving me your time. And for our viewers out there, is there anything you want to say to them? And maybe start with that young African girl.
Wow. Thank you so much for all those compliments. It's always so moving to hear people who are on the receiving end of the work that I do. I think, you know, what I would say is to I guess any African girl out there is to keep dreaming and to know that there's power in the ability to still want to take hold of your life. I value the ability to be able to live the life that I want to live and create the life that I want to create. And I think we have been given all the skills to do that. And sometimes it's harder than we think, but I don't know. I guess because of the way that I grew up, resilience is so important for me. So I know that things are not very easy right now, but I hope that people find the inspiration to keep going and to be able to create the lives that they want to create. And some of it may not happen in our lifetime, but it's worth being able to say, at least I tried while I was on earth to curate the life that I wanted to curate for my life, for myself.
Thank you very much. And where can we find you? I know you mentioned, if you can mention your blog spot again, if you can mention your Instagram, your Twitter. You put out a lot of stuff on Twitter as well.
Yeah. So on Twitter, I'm at Athambile. On Instagram, it's at Overthinking Teacher, at Asina Kutula, which is the collective we spoke about. And the blogspot is ikhandilam.blogspot.com. And I mean, telling which people can email me, it's atambile@gmail.com. And we can Google. But those are the platforms that.
Thank you very much, Athambile. I really appreciate it, eh?
It's a pleasure, TK. Thanks. I hope you're well there in Canada.
We're trying to survive. We're just hanging on. It's been a roller coaster, but we're here.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care and have a great week. All right.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
That was Athambile Masola. She calls herself the overthinking teacher. She's full of wisdom. She's been doing a lot of research. She writes, and I believe these are the people in Africa which we need to keep putting out there so that people know that there are people who are really trying to push and get positive results, and for Africa and for the African women, for everybody, and that's why I have the platform. I'll keep bringing people like her who are putting such amount of their time just trying to make the changes we hope for the next generation. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll catch you next week as well, as usual. Thank you.